Is on. And is on.
Here we go, guys.
On.
5,
4, 3.
Here we go, guys.
On.
5,
4, 3.
Here we go,
Hi
guys.
everyone, it's
5,
Chris Cheung over
4,
here,
3.
and we've got
Here we
a
go,
special
guys.
guest. Who are you?
5,
Chris Cheung
4.
over here.
Hi everyone.
And
My
we've
name
got
is
a special
Simran
guest. Who are you?
Singh, and I'm very excited
Hi
to be here
everyone.
today.
My special guest. We hadn't had the chance to have tea in person, so this is quite an honor.
Yeah, I've actually been waiting for this day, Chris. I don't know about you. Very excited.
Now we get to do it in front of a live audience.
Yeah. Except it just looks like me and you talking to each other, so it's a little less nerve-wracking.
Feels very normal.
Yeah, it feels normal.
Just so everyone knows, we've had a bit of a tech glitch, so we'll actually be starting a few minutes late. But some things you can do in the meantime, you can have your kettle going, and we'll also be taking questions, which we'll be answering half an hour in. So in the box below, you can type whatever you want. We'll try our best to get through them. Or if you just want to say hi and let us know where you're coming from, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Yes. Where are you all coming from?
I wonder if there'll be some Burnaby people you can give a shout out to.
Yeah, right. We have to, as people may know, as I am the Burnaby Beacon person, I want to know all the Burnaby things. So please shout out Burnaby in the chat if you can.
Maybe we'll get some secret scoops out of this.
Yeah.
The house is on a stream.
The Rainforest Cafe still exists.
That was the best investigative feature and popular anthropology.
Yeah, I really had to dig deep for that one. It was it was really fun to actually write during the kind of terrible times we're in. It's always good to escape back to the 90s.
Yeah, the nostalgia hit.
Place. Yeah, the nostalgia makes you feel, pardon me, a lot better. Especially thinking of the simpler times when we would go to the mall and go to some novelty
Cafe was
attraction.
Terrifying.
It was
that mother tree that would speak.
And I actually only went myself once because I don't know my parents.
Like inside, like to dine in.
Yeah, it was actually for a birthday party, so that's why I was allowed to go. But I don't remember ever going there for actually. I don't remember down meals.
I think there's an echo.
Yeah, just heard myself, which is the worst.
If anyone's joining in late, just to let you know that there's a bit of a tech glitch, but you can, in the meantime, put comments in the chat below. We'll be doing our best to answer all of them about half an hour in.
Has our echo disappeared, Chris? Are we okay?
It's gone.
Okay. I don't know. We are not tech people. We are just flying by the seat of our pants right now. So
I was confessing earlier that I've never set up a Zoom once. And I still refuse to, I won't do it.
Yes, when we actually first met to discuss this and prep, Chris was like, hey, can you set up the Zoom? Because I haven't. I was like, okay.
I won't do it. Oh, we've got a lot of cool places that people are coming in from. Ladysmith on the Island. There's actually a bunch of Burnaby.
Yay. Hi, everyone. CJSF, hello.
Nanaimo, Victoria, Ottawa. Oh, someone who wrote a really great letter that will be in next week is joining us today. Chile, Edmonton, Abbotsford.
Ooh. Everywhere.
Nelson. This is great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for wanting to spend your afternoon with us. Feel kind of honored, Chris.
Yes. Wonder what tea is everybody having?
Uh-oh. Okay. Well, I gotta confess. I actually just have water today because I forgot. I should have been booted off this live stream right now. I think you should find a new guest.
I also have a confession. I'm also having just a cup of water. I think this is going to be a scandal.
I was telling Chris earlier that I actually had so much coffee this morning to the point where if I had any other type of caffeinated drink, I might like totally explode. So my apologies, but I hope everyone is enjoying their tea. You know, thank you for understanding the assignment, which we clearly didn't. But maybe if we have another chat, we can have tea. Chris.
Oh, a friend of mine's calling us out on this scandal.
Oh my gosh. This is a PR nightmare.
I saw tea on the poster. I was promised tea. Tuning in from Montreal, Toronto. And thank you for understanding the tech glitches.
Yeah.
Tetley Bold, closest thing to Scottish blend you can get in Canada. Love
My parents love Tetley Bold. They love their tea with they're big tea drinkers.
My parents
are you a tea drinker, Chris?
I drink everything.
All beverages.
That's why I had to hold off for today because I get too caffeinated. I'm
too excited.
People are saying hello. I'm saying hello from like Paul River drinking Earl Grey. This is great.
Oh, that's actually really nice.
All right, I think we're gonna get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. So obviously I'm supposed to introduce myself here, but I think you all know that I write for the Tyee. I'm Chris. And if you can believe it, it's actually been 2 months since we did our last live event when we launched the newsletter, and now we're wrapping it up. So thank you so much for reading along. We've got over 5,000 subscribers, which we did not expect. Really appreciate that. And we also hear from about up to 55 people per week. So I'm still doing my best to get through all the emails, but do keep it coming. And thank you so much for joining us today too. So I'm obviously not alone. We have a special guest here with me, and we thought it'd be boring if you were just to hear from me again. And I was like, oh, who should we have who also writes about race and representation? Like, who else is in my cohort who's figuring this stuff out? And also somebody who works with newsletters as well. So obviously that's just one person. So I'm really excited to welcome Simran Singh here, managing editor of the Burnaby Beacon. Hi, Simran. Thanks so much for joining us today. Oh no, is Simran frozen?
Hello, sorry. Can you hear me, Chris?
Yes, I can hear you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I had a little bit of a Wi-Fi blip there, so I hope it doesn't happen again. Sorry, you might just have to repeat what you just said.
It's all good. We're just welcoming you right now, and thanking you for joining us. Oh no, have we lost Simran? Simran, can you hear us? Okay, I think you're back.
Okay, sorry. This wasn't happening before, but can you hear me? Good?
Yes, this is perfect.
Okay. This was not happening during our test period, so my apologies, everyone. But I suppose that, should I introduce myself now?
Yeah,
Okay.
So we've got, where are you from? Where do you work?
Yeah, so I'm very grateful to be able to work and live on the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Coquitlam and Squamish-speaking peoples. As Chris may have mentioned there during my Wi-Fi blip, I'm the managing editor of the Burnaby Beacon newsletter, independent news serving Burnaby. It's a new venture and it has been great. We tell all types of stories about the diversity and community that we have in the city of ours. So I'm so happy to be here today with Chris.
Great. And Simran, you were behind me at school by 1 year, also at UBC's journalism school.
Yeah.
Previously worked at the Daily Hive as the city editor in Vancouver. And that's where I read almost all your pieces and stole a lot of ideas as well.
Well, it's funny, Chris, because we've actually like crossed paths. I didn't know that we were so close in school and you were only a year ahead of me. And yeah, now we're here.
This is great. And I know this might be a bit early for a tea time for Pacific time, but we've got a lot of people joining us from different time zones. So thank you for that. And it's never too early for a cup of tea, really, even though I confessed I was drinking water. Just a moment earlier.
Yeah, me too. I'm so sorry, everyone.
And
we are
I'm
scam artists.
And I'm joining from Vancouver, which is on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And speaking of Vancouver, Burnaby, and unceded territory, if you're familiar with Kingsway in Vancouver and Burnaby, the Burnaby Beacon has a really great feature. That was one of my favorite things that I read this year, called Kingsway Before the Kings. So make sure you check that one out.
Yeah, it's a good story.
So what are we going to do today? Simran and I are going to do our own Q&A for the first half hour. And then for audience questions, there's a box, I think it should be right below me right now, where you can submit whatever you want to ask us. We'll do our best to go through them. And we'll start now. So first thing I wanted to ask you, Simran, so you grew up in Burnaby. And when you were growing up, how did people talk about race and talk about culture and all of that stuff?
Yeah, Chris, I think maybe you can kind of relate to this, but being a kid in high school during like the late 2000s or whatever, or the early 2010s, I think a lot of how I started picking up on race was in high school and noticing that I didn't fit in with that quintessential group of brown kids. Like, I don't know why. And I always had a trouble finding my place, especially in my teens, as to who I was. And I think a lot of it had to deal with some internalized racism and not feeling good about my own culture and background towards myself. Like, I was a little bit embarrassed to be Punjabi and, you know, to be different, or have parents who spoke a different language in public, or, you know, have grandparents who spoke a different language. And I think it was because maybe I went to a whiter elementary school, or I just never found my group. And I really struggled with my identity and kind of tried to push it away. So race was something that I didn't really want to think about maybe in high school. And that was a time when so many people were in their own like little enclaves in high school as well. And I felt a little lost. So yeah, it was kind of confusing for me during my teen years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it was like never something like you could escape. Like race was like always a thing.
It was always a thing, but I didn't want it to be a thing. And I'm not too sure how you felt and like how those discussions were when you were growing up.
Yeah, so I grew up in a pretty diverse part of Vancouver. Like I grew up right on like the east-west side border. It was very much a majority minority place, as people would say. And everyone was, I think, very, very overly fascinated about everybody's background. So like what languages they spoke, like somebody who was mixed, they'd be curious about their parents or what holidays they celebrated. And I think when it comes to like growing up as part of a diaspora, people talk about the lunchbox moment a lot. So like if you bring in some sort of food that you know, your whiter classmates are not used to seeing, and you know, you get made fun of, or like saying like, oh, that's weird or stinky or whatever. But we never really had that, like being in a majority minority place. And instead people would be really excited about what like snacks or foods that other people brought in. So it's like, oh, like you have like seaweed snacks, or like, oh, you have like fruit leather or Pocky. So diversity was like this, I don't know, I don't know if it's like a commodity, but something people were really like interested in. And that would continue into high school too, with other cultural things like, oh, like you're Korean, like I'm really into K-pop, or like, oh, you're Indian, like I really am into like Bhangra. But then there's like a darker side to that too. Like if your English had like, you know, had some sort of accent, like that was made fun of. Or if somebody's parents were like too strict, you'd be called like, oh, that's, you know, so Asian of your parents. Like too strict, so, you'd be yeah, there was like this weird sense of like so Asian, like a good side to it, like a bad side to it. Yeah, there was like this weird sense of tying identity, good side to it, like a bad side to it. Yeah, there was like this weird sense of tying identity, good side to it, like a bad side.
Yeah, and it was cool because I did go to a very diverse high school. Yeah, and it pointed out because I existed as well. Like there was and it pointed out because I existed as well. Like there was, but yeah, and it pointed out exist where I fall. And I don't think I embarked on that journey until a little bit later in life. I'm still kind of figuring it out later, but I'm still kind of more figuring it out later, but I'm still kind of more figuring it out later, but I'm still kind of more. So Chris, I want to know the big question. Yeah. So Chris, you're so talented and wonderful, but how did you become a journalist? So Chris, you're so talented and wonderful, but how did you become a I'm just here to give you praise. No, I'm just kidding. But no, how did you? I'm just here to give you praise. No, I'm just kidding. But no, how did to get into this field? I'm just here to give you praise. No, I'm just kidding. But no, how did
So I
to
never
get
really
into
read the
this
news
field? I'm just here to
growing
give
up.
you
Like,
praise. No, I'm just kidding.
my
But
dad
no, how
was.
did
So I
to
never
get
really
into
read
this
the
field?
news
I'm just here to
growing
give you
up. Like,
praise. No, I'm just kidding.
my dad wasn't really sure why for a really long time, but I just felt like it was intriguing. So then, now like what I just felt like it was like, oh well, this is like this is so then now like what I just felt like white people, oh well, this is like this is so then now like people and white and yeah, and I started wondering, oh, how come like places that I'm familiar with, like I would never see them in the news, like that I'm if you live in Vancouver, I see there diversity that's around you. But that wasn't something that I saw like reflected in a lot of coverage, and so yeah, at first I was like, oh well, maybe like the places that I visit or the places that I go to aren't important. But then later on, I'm like, oh, well, maybe that isn't the case. Like maybe it's just that it doesn't get covered. And then you would see, certain neighborhoods, I kept making fun of Mount Pleasant in the newsletter, but like hipper places like that, like somebody sneezes and it's something that ends up in the news. But if something happens like, on the east or south side of like Vancouver or in another city, even if it's something big like this block is being destroyed, it just wasn't picked up on. So I think cluing into that kind of inequality of what gets covered and what gets represented made me really want to be like, oh well, the people that I see, the places that I go to, like I really want to see that in the news.
Yeah, I totally get that, and I think I can kind of I can relate to that as well as the familiar feeling. I think our job is to answer questions, but when you're a racialized journalist and you begin to see things differently, and you begin to see gaps in the regular mainstream news coverage. And it's cool that your work is able to fill those gaps, and I think you did so much of that with the newsletter too.
Thanks. Well, same with you. I mean, even being in Burnaby, I think people, we mentioned Burnaby in the newsletter too. Like people might dismiss it as like, oh, this is a suburb, it's sleepy, there's nothing there except the mall, but not really realize like, oh, well, what is the life that happens in this city?
Yeah, and now that I am taking on news in Burnaby, I've realized that there is so much going on here. Like you can look at a single block on Edmonds, let's say, and there are like maybe 100, maybe 70 to 80 different shops, and all those people are from different places. Like they're immigrants, and those places are so interesting, but they often get missed. And why do they get missed? And I'm grateful to be able to now do this type of reporting to really look at a suburb, but the different sections and what makes the suburb work and the people behind it, because oftentimes we don't see that at all.
Yeah. Edmonds is great. Everybody should go eat on Edmonds and check it out.
Lots of good restaurants, guys. Plugging for Edmonds.
All right, my turn for a question now. So this is a question about the white gaze, and I thought we should probably define what I mean when I'm talking about the white gaze. Because at the beginning, when we announced this newsletter, it has such a provocative title, and people are like, oh, are you saying that like any story written by a white person is like an evil story and that they shouldn't be allowed to write it? That is not the case. When we're talking about what it means to have a gaze like this, a white gaze, like we're talking about some kind of power dynamic, like when it comes to representation. So like anybody can take on the white gaze. I've taken on the white gaze in my reporting before, and I've broken out into three things. So there's the author who's doing the journalism. There's the audience who's being catered to. There's the actors who's written about and how they're being written about. So if you have like a food writer who's used to, maybe they're writing about Edmonds and writing about a pho place for like a wider audience, they might talk about Vietnamese food as like exotic, or it's an adventure to try this stuff. So anyway, my question is like, have you ever taken on the white gaze in your reporting and what that's been like?
Yeah, it feels kind of like, oh man, like, yes, I have. And it's very possible for racialized journalists to do this and take on the white gaze. And I think early on in my reporting, especially when I was at Daily Hive, and that was such a huge audience. And when I began to really feel comfortable about reporting on different issues and things going on in the South Asian communities, I should say, because we're all different communities in the Lower Mainland, I really realized that a lot of it was, how do I make a sound really acceptable to people or likable. And I think that just happened in my head without knowing. Like, what are the feel good stories I can take on? What are the things that make people realize that, you know, in Sikhism, for the Punjabi Sikh community, that seva, things like selfless service, are part of the tenets of our faith. So I really focused on those feel good stories, which are great and they're important, but I think it's surface level in some way, because it doesn't really get down to, you know, kind of the nitty gritty of what makes communities work, or what's behind them, or why a certain thing is happening within that community. And I guess I want to ask you, I mean, your work is so incredible, but did you ever find a point where you were taking on the white gaze?
Definitely. That's, you know, you mentioned about like the service that the Sikh community here like does. You see that so often, like anytime there's any kind of like disaster, like the flooding, like for example. And then I don't know, I guess the criticism would be like, oh, are you saying like we can't write these like positive stories? And I don't, that's not what I'm saying, right? Like I feel like, you know, what else is existing like for this group? Like, is this the only thing that you're ever covering? And how are you covering it too? So for me, I've done it a lot, like in terms of like the content, like describing a place as like, it's like, oh, nothing used to happen here. And then now like there's like this new thing, but ignoring like who actually used to live there. And I think with any kind of perspective that a journalist comes from, there are places that they're going to leave out. So that might be people groups, that might be culture, like that might be like a place. Like if I'm living in Vancouver and I'm, you know, covering something in Burnaby, for example, that I don't know about, I'm gonna have like that outsider view too. So that's really hard. I think checking our perspective is something we always should be doing. But I also wonder too, like I mentioned this in like one of the issues about how I think we always do have to kind of consider the white gaze sometimes, sadly, like maybe not overly catering to it, but the fact that like if we're writing to a mass audience, is there some kind of bridging that we have to do so that people understand what we're talking about, but not to do too much hand holding at the same time. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting and kind of delicate balance, because you have to consider your audience and how much they might know. I think there was one instance where this happened recently, and I was writing about a gurdwara, and Dustin, my colleague, I put in brackets the gurdwara, and I put Sikh temple in brackets, and Dustin was like, "Why? You don't need to do that. Like, I think people know what a gurdwara is." And it's like, do they? Yeah, maybe they do. But this is me then overthinking that I need to explain to people what this place of worship is, so they understand it, so they don't get confused. So navigating that can be tricky. You don't want to feel like you're dumbing things down, but you also want to do your job of being thorough and precise. So those are little things that sometimes I notice in my reporting. Like, do I need to over explain this concept? How much work does the audience need to do to just simply search that up or figure it out? Because we're in the space where, you know, we can Google things now and learn about them at our own fingertips. Yeah, right? Like, what a concept.
There was somebody wrote into me about something I hadn't heard about, but the concept was the explanatory comma, and it's like having like the Gurura comma or like brackets, like Sikh temple. And it was from a podcast where they had talked about Tupac without explaining who he was, and then everyone was very confused.
Oh no! See, then I'm like, come on, guys, you got to do your work on that one. Come on. Sorry, I know we have a list of questions, and I just got a little bit bamboozled as usual.
Shocked by the confusion around Tupac.
Yeah, I wanted to know though, Chris, like what it's like being a journalist of color. As people know, we're in Vancouver, Metro Vancouver. There's a plethora of diversity here, and it should be easy, right? Right?
Yeah, I from my journalism school experience, I'm sure from other schools too, like, you know, you would have courses like a course on video and like a course on like audio, but I don't think there was really a course that's like, oh, if you're a racialized person, like this is, you know, stuff that you should know, like when you're doing your reporting. And I feel like I'm thinking about like high school when we looked at literature, it's like, person versus self, person versus person. Like I feel like when we are writing these stories, there's a lot of a burden, like whatever community or culture that you're writing about, like you really don't want to get it wrong. Especially because there's not much on, whatever it is that we're writing about out there, right? So if you get it wrong, like you might let that community down. If you get it wrong, like people from outside it would have the wrong impression of what it's about too. And so, and if you're, and if it's something that you personally celebrate or personally partake in, right? Like you just feel a lot of anguish if you're misrepresenting, something like that. And then also answering to readers too. Like I feel like some of them get really offended when you write about anything to do with culture or race. Like if I were to, write about like, like a Mexican restaurant, somebody would be like, oh, well, why did you leave out like the Jamaican restaurant? And it's really strange. And, when I touch on like inequality, and if I'm mentioning race, or if I mention the word white, then I also get feedback too. It's like, oh, well, like, why are you dividing people with this kind of coverage? So I feel like there's a lot of extra stuff that we have to consider as a racialized journalist. And yeah, like a lot of that I just had to go on Google and like find how to prep myself for on my own.
Yeah, I think for myself, like a lot of questions or comments I got, especially in the past few years, is if I write something about a specific community, the comments would be like, who cares? And one of the things that I've learned, and I'm sure you have learned too, is do not pay attention to reader comments. They do not serve you in any shape, or form. They're often not the best. But finding out like, okay, why am I writing this? Does it even matter to anyone? And you know what? I think I've come to terms with it doesn't matter if it matters to anyone. If it reaches, 3 people and it matters to them, and this story means something to them, or they learned something, or they were able to, identify with that narrative, then that's all you need to do. And I'm trying to think of my role as maybe a journalist of color as I don't need to please everyone. I just need to do work that is hopefully meaningful, and it will reach the right people or audience. And as long as it does that, then I feel good about my work.
Yeah. When I feel the same way about thinking about those 3 people. Like sometimes I've seen stories where it's like somebody pointing at like a drain, and there's like leaves on the drain, and then the headline just like, oh, like drain hasn't been cleared like in this neighborhood. And I'm like, okay, well, if you're writing about that, and then somebody else is writing about this, cultural thing that's really, really important to them, it's like, oh, well, I don't see why something like that should deserve the coverage, and then this shouldn't.
Yeah, totally. And I'm really grateful now that I think in some journalism spaces, I would like to say the Tyee and, Burnaby Beacon independent media gives you more space to explore topics on race and community and culture in a way that you don't feel restricted. So I felt at least that I can open myself up to this more and feel more confident in my reporting.
Definitely. Yeah. My turn now. So I read a lot of your pieces on COVID and South Asian communities here in Metro Van and the Lower Mainland. And I was wondering, how do you cover something, like race and a big crisis with sensitivity and with nuance?
Yeah, so last year, I think around this time, Chris, is like I did put out a series on the South Asian communities here in Metro Vancouver. And at that time, numbers were going up in those specific communities, especially within Surrey. There was very high case counts. And then we kept hearing this kind of narrative that COVID is happening to South Asian people. But I thought, where is the explanation as to why? We know it's happening, but there's got to be a reason or something we're not talking about. So that was a really big, tough topic to cover. And I don't even think I got to the tip of the iceberg. But what I thought about, and when I was writing that series, is all of the, and you mentioned this in your newsletter, the intersectionalities of why it was happening. Is it a community like gone rogue, just having huge parties because we don't care? No, that is absolutely not why there were high COVID numbers within South Asian communities here. There was much more going on. It had to do with labor, with family structure, with translation services, with access, with transit access. There was a list of reasons why this was happening and was getting missed in daily briefings from our provincial health officials. And of course, they have so much to talk about that they go on to the next topic as quick as possible to inform the public. But then who's going to inform the public about why people were getting sick, why people who looked like, my grandfather were getting sick? And funny enough, not funny enough, actually, it's terrible. My whole family had COVID when I was writing those articles. And it was just so surreal. And luckily, I do live in a quote unquote multi-generational household. So I live with my in-laws, my husband, my sister. I live in a big household right now. And to think about how tough it was for people who might not have separate rooms to isolate. And this is a very normal cultural thing within Punjabi families, is we're tight-knit and live together, and that's just, we share space, whatever. But it was seen as very different. So you have to kind of break it down and in ways that you can understand your own family. And luckily enough, I was reporting on something familiar to me. I knew some dynamics of South Asian culture that helped me with this reporting. But it really, really made me realize how health and intersectionality, just these two things need to come together in future health reporting. We cannot go about topics like COVID or a global pandemic without having data on racialized data or actual numbers to understand this. So it was tough, but I hope that it was informative, at least.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Like journalists are told like, oh, well, you have to have a thick skin, like when you do reporting, but especially if you're like a journalist of color, and then you're writing about something that's so personal to you, and then you read stuff in the comments like, oh, like, why are people living this way? Like they're being irresponsible, all of that. But it really, really hurts, right? But at the same time, like you feel that like, oh, well, this is an experience that I haven't really seen covered like in this way. And I think this is important to publish. But then you're putting yourself out there, and that's just something you have to face too.
Yeah, it was definitely a very interesting time. You're dealing with people in your own family sick, and you're writing about the reasons why. So yeah, but I'm glad I did that reporting. I'm really glad. And
yeah, well, that's why I decided to steal from it and do some coverage of my own, because it was so important.
Sharing is caring. Sharing is caring. But Chris, now I want to know a serious question, because everyone has haters, and I want to know how you deal with your haters.
I think this newsletter has been a way for me to express some of that, like to dissect what people mean. Like when they say that, talking about race is racist, like, well, what do they think racism is? Like, are they saying that, I'm like dividing people up, and that we're actually all like united, and I should be focusing on that instead? But I feel like it's really silly, because like, well, we obviously know that we live in a world that has racial inequality. And so you would report on it like you would any other kind of inequality. And the biggest one that I always get, that I've mentioned in this newsletter, is climate. Even after I wrote about this, people were like, oh, well, why are you focusing on race? Like, why don't you focus on climate? But I feel like with any crisis, as you said, like there's many different intersections to it. And I think it's just taught me that people don't really know how to talk about race. Like when Bonnie Henry and other health officials seemed nervous about talking about race, it's like, oh, we're afraid to be transparent about this because we can't trust people to not be racist. And then so they just, back off away from it, apparently, whereas other provinces were happy to share that information. And so, yeah, I think that's just, it's sad that this kind of sensitivity is like, that's the world that I'm publishing these stories like into. So I feel like, yeah, there is a lot of work to be done to try and like dial it down. Because I feel like when people say like, oh, well, like climate change affects everyone, or like COVID affects everyone, they think that something about like the pigmentation of people's skin like makes it more likely that they'll like catch a virus. But it's like, oh, when like that's not what we're talking about here, right? It's like the stuff you mentioned, like what kind of job are they doing, like where do they live, how much money are they making, like what kind of transportation like are they taking like every day, all of that stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think when you touch on the fact that, people even ask, like, why are you talking about race in the first place? But when something very traumatic happens, and for example, when a whole family gets brutally murdered in Ontario, and they were a Muslim family, at that point the country stops and we pause and we say hate has no place. And we can talk about race then, but only when something bad or big happens. So why can't we talk about race every day? Because race impacts everything we do. It's something that we love to avoid, but we shouldn't be avoiding having these honest conversations. And if people are offended and upset by that, then maybe they're the ones that need to be part of these conversations and kind of unpack why. Because that discomfort is going to lead us to a point where I think we can start figuring out what we even need to start talking about to understand each other a little bit better. But there's so many feelings of, oh, I'm uncomfortable, or this doesn't need to be talked about, or why are you even approaching this from this lens, which I think sucks.
Yeah, it's like, unless someone gets punched in the face, then you don't notice that there's other kinds of racism.
Totally.
Yeah. All right. I'm looking at the time here, so we have to check out some of these great questions that people have been writing in. I had one that somebody had emailed in, and I felt like I had to start off with this one, and then I'll let you pick one after. Okay, but this is what somebody said. My salami and mortadella sandwiches at school were looked upon with comments as to its foreignness and smell with wrinkled noses. Today, these cold cuts are mainstream and sold in every mainstream grocery deli counter. This is true of every wave of migration of immigrants that comes to Canada. It is the rite of passage to eventually becoming the norm. It is not wrong. It is familiarization that leads to normalization. Acceptance of their food leads to acceptance of their culture, and then acceptance into the country. Just wondering what you make of this.
Yeah, what a way to kick it off. It's interesting that this idea of acceptance, well, we just need to, some sorry for the swearing, some shitty stuff needs to happen, but then you'll be accepted and it'll be fine. Like, why is there's this idea that we need some sort of hazing before things get accepted? Why is that the thought process? That, you know what, like, yeah, kids made fun of me, but it's fine now. I think that's a really damaging and maybe not the best way to go about thinking about things, because when you think about it on the personal level, and just a personal anecdote here, my mom went to school like in Vancouver Island during like the 60s and 70s. And when people made fun of her food, like, it emotionally scarred her to the point where I think she still has like PTSD and some severe mental trauma from the way that people treated her differently. Like, this isn't just stuff that we can be like, yeah, it's fine, people are going to accept you. Like, this has real human trauma. And yeah, I feel very passionately that thought process is wrong. Why are some totally people go ahead, please go ahead.
Well, it's like, what, as you said, hazing is a good word to describe it, but it's like, why is this something that's normal, and like, why is it something that's accepted? And I also was like, just because I had an issue on food. It's like, why is the acceptance of food or any kind of culture like dependent on what the mass audience, which is usually a white audience, likes, right? It's just like, oh, well, if they say that this is what's ready to be like put in the mainstream grocery store, then that's what gets to be accepted. But what about like all of the other food or all of the other like behavior or culture that people have that doesn't get accepted, right? Like, it's not like there's like this linear thing of like, oh, you slowly get assimilated like over time. It's like, it's usually by some kind of choice. There's usually some kind of inequality to it.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that whole lunchbox narrative is continuing on, and it's so interesting to see how it evolves and what people think about it. But I would like to disagree there. But how about we choose another reader question?
Yeah, do you want to pick one?
Sure. I see one from Regina Jonker. I think that's pronounced correctly. Sorry if I mispronounced your last name there, but it says, she said, do you see the possibility of the concept of journalism through the white gaze being addressed in journalism programs / professional spaces? It's one thing to educate the public, but what about journalists as a group? In other words, the system. Oh, sorry, my dog.
Oh, that's so I guess I have to take this one.
Please do.
I think the first thing is admitting that this exists. like I think even in our profession, like, you know, think about journalistic objectivity, right? Like we don't usually think that like, you know, our point of view is going to impact like whatever we write about. But like the kinds of stories that we choose, how we describe like a people, a place, or a culture, all of that gets baked into it. And I just remember at the beginning of COVID, it wasn't even in the article, but it was in the photos that would be chosen to accompany pieces on the coronavirus. It was like telephoto shots of East Asian looking people at the airport, and then being paired with these pieces. And so it's like, oh, well, like, what are you trying to say over here? Like with this, yeah, it's like a photograph, but this was obviously chosen with some kind of intent. So I think, yeah, recognizing that like we all do come from some place, like it's very hard to be like purely absolutely objective. That's like the first thing. Yeah, I mean that's why I wrote this newsletter, and there's a lot more conversation to be had. So I would hope that there's much more interest in this, especially in a place like Canada, where a lot of people use that as an excuse to say like, oh well, but we're multicultural, like we don't, like we're not like the US, we're better than the US, and we don't need to talk about these things.
Sorry, my little puppy is having a breakdown, so he's in the room with
Very
me. I'm
typical
so sorry.
of Zoom.
But I think we were talking about this before, Chris, just the idea that we do need to have these discussions in journalism schools. We do need to start really seriously breaking down these topics so that we can have honest conversations. And I think you mentioned this, we didn't have these chats or even really touch upon race and the white gaze in journalism school at all. I think there was some discussion about how we report fairly on race, or, you know, they go through kind of the motions. And not to say that professors didn't try, it's just you need to learn so much to become a journalist. So where do we make space for this? But I really, really strongly think that we need to start, I think your newsletter could be a course. I think this needs to be like an actual taught course, and we need to start thinking about this more seriously.
I've chosen the right guest to hype up myself.
I was not paid to hype up. I was not paid to hype up. I'm being honest.
Well, there's talking about schools, like not to hate on stuff like VR or like drones and all that, but I felt like there was such like a preoccupation with, you know, cutting edge tech versus new ways to tell stories that we weren't considering. So I feel like, you know, that's more or equally or more important than, you know, being able to like fly a drone over Abbotsford or something.
Yeah, most definitely. Or like how to tweet properly. And it's like, we got to think more critically here, people.
Yeah. Okay, let me take a look here. This is another great one that I had that somebody sent in by email. So they said that in a recent New Yorker short story by, I guess this is Gish Jen, a Chinese woman living in New York says to her son, "We're not people of color, we're rich." So very provocative. What do you think?
It's so interesting how this idea of success in I think for older immigrant generations, maybe our parents and grandparents, this idea that if we work hard and we have a certain amount of money or things to show that we worked hard for what we have, this concept of race gets kind of taken out by what we've achieved. I know that, you know, I've heard comments like this, like, you know what, if you work hard, you will be able to achieve anything. You'll achieve the Canadian dream, and people will accept you. I think this is a very common narrative, you know, that I've heard. But it's interesting because for us, I think we see for maybe younger generations, we see kind of past that. We see the racism that happens to, you know, older folks despite what they've worked for. So there is really no way to block out the racism or achieve things beyond, you know, race. At the end of the day, this is something that is happening still. It's not stopping. I don't know, what do you think about that, Chris?
I completely agree. I've heard the same thing from older immigrants that say like, oh, well, like racism, yeah, like it was a thing, like, you know, people pushed me around when I was young, but like I have a house now, like I have a car, like I have this job, like my kids are in university. And it was like this attitude of like, oh, well, I can kind of like buy my way out of racism. And that this is something that everybody can do if they work hard. but I mean, their experience is not everybody else's experience, right? Like, and you're also, you're kind of allowing the system to do its thing, which is push people down if they are a person of color, and you're choosing to like tiptoe around that and like accomplish what you can within that rather than challenging it. So I can see what this character in the story is saying, but it's also very disturbing to me.
Yeah, I agree. And apologies to anyone. I am dealing with a very interesting golden retriever right now. So if you hear any growls, my bad. I wish I could show you all of it. He's very cute, but he's having a moment right now. I have a question, Chris. This one comes from Robot Museum.
Robot Museum.
Yeah. Language in journalism can be challenging. How do you balance finding the right words, and when the words don't exist, how do you convey them in the language you're using is not intended to hurt?
Oh my goodness, this is so challenging. I wrote the issue on this, but I still don't know how to answer it. Yeah, I had read that NPR piece that I had shared in the newsletter about how it's like, oh, is it racialized? Like, is it person of color? Is it like visible minority? I was really shocked because so Canadian Press is the organization that determines like the style guide for journalists and like the words that we should use or not use. And in it, it even said like use people of color, but this term is like on its way out. And I was really shocked. But it's to acknowledge that, you know, language isn't perfect. And our relationship with like what a lot of these words mean is going to change over time as well. So, I mean, personally, I always try to use stuff that just doesn't other people. Even for something like non-white, like I tried to avoid that because I didn't want to flatten everybody else in one category. But I had a reader who very thoughtfully wrote in, and she said like, oh, well, like I think it's important to have this distinction because it shows that people are being measured to this baseline of whiteness, and we need to use it to show that like society has split up people in these two camps. So I don't know other than that to constantly be aware of it and watch out for that othering thing and be ready to be flexible because language changes.
Yeah, language is ever evolving, and how we take from it and what we make of it is constantly changing as well. But something I think that I've noticed, Chris, is even before we met on this during this event, like we've chatted sometimes, and sometimes you've asked me like, hey, like, does this word work for this story that I'm using about, you know, like we can also ask each other questions. We can,
yes,
as journalists, we can kind of do a little bit of thinking together and brainstorming and bouncing ideas off one another to see if that works or how we can expand on that more. So that's also comforting to know that we as a journalistic community can do that and see how we can incorporate that into our work.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I almost forgot about it.
No, yeah, it's just cool that we can just bounce ideas off of one another too.
Yeah, I had run into a journalist who's a bit older than me. She's a person of color, and I ran into like buying fruit while the newsletter was going. She's like, "Oh no, Chris! Like I'm so scared you're gonna find my old article where I described sushi in this very like exotifying way." And I was just like, it's fine. Like you didn't mean to like, you know, make it seem like this weird like other thing, I'm sure, like at the time. And it's like, yeah, like we're gonna make mistakes. And I really didn't want like the newsletter or any of these pieces to be like, oh, these are the rules that like you must follow or else we're gonna cancel you. It's more of like thinking about the language that we are using.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. All right, let's see. I gotta pick something else here. Oh, your colleague is saying he left Milo or Milo.
Oh, Milo, that's Dustin. Thank you, Dustin. Yeah, Milo he's always everywhere and anywhere that I need to be. So he's on the floor right now.
Question here. If there's a problematic word that we see authorities using that is indicative of their lack of consideration of race. I fought the VPD for years on their use of Asian in news releases, and only now do they seem to be dropping it. That's really tough because I feel that for press releases, it's like for the purposes of like identification.
I think it's not words, maybe not, but I think, Chris, you also talked about this in the newsletter, of course, about this generalizing of a community, especially when it comes to crime. I know for myself, this past summer, there were several instances of gang violence, which involved, younger South Asian men, and the way that was reported on, and the fact that it just becomes such a singular idea of what this group of young men are, that can be really, really harmful. So I don't know. My goal is maybe that language needs to change by explanation as to, for example, being specific here about gang shootings and why maybe this is impacting the South Asian diaspora here. We can't just have like one single press release that we go off of to understand why something happened. Like this shooting happened and another shooting happened at the Cactus Club and the police need to respond. Like we need to have more nuanced reporting to kind of break this down more, because it's just those singular terms like South Asian man. And I'm like, okay, so what about him though? Like what aren't we digging into deeper here about why this is happening or why we've seen this happen? So for me, it's more like terms, like very broad in terms in reporting, especially police reports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as a communications person, like this is something that we should, that they should be thinking about, right? Like everything that you're putting out is going to generate some kind of a reaction. And I was thinking about, like Bonnie Henry again last year, like she had said that there are, high rates of COVID among South Asian communities. And then she, despite the fact that she didn't give us any data, and I'm still very upset about that, she did say like, oh, well, this is like not to blame them. Like this is a labor thing. This is where they're living, like in the suburbs. Like these are the kinds of workplaces that you would find in the suburbs and all of that. And I think having a disclaimer like that is really important, not just being like, oh, these are the numbers of the day, here's who's being affected, and like that's it. Like if you're realizing that what you're putting out there, like for example, a lot of like something to do with crime and race, and putting the picture and the name out there, and then the news is picking that up, like how you're responding to that, right? Like if you're seeing that it does have a negative effect.
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe a few more questions, maybe. And I see one actually from Lauren Kelger. Hi, Lauren. I know you from journalism school. So cool that you're in the chat. She's amazing. What's your process for determining what stories need to be told? And actually, Chris, this is a great question for you, because I'm so interested in knowing how, like, where do you come up with your ideas, and then how do you prioritize those ideas?
I think it's just stuff that isn't covered. Like a lot of the time I'm writing something that I think was really important to like some community like years ago, but nobody ever touched on. Like I wrote a piece on Crystal Mall. Crystal Mall is like 21 years old. There's some coverage about it in the beginning, like from like a development standpoint. It's like, oh yeah, we're having a new mall in Burnaby, but that was it. And so it's like, oh, well, if I'm talking about like what this place like means to the community, this is something that could have been written about like a decade ago. And so, yeah, a lot of the places that I drive by, I'm like, oh, this has been here forever. Like, how come this hasn't been covered? Being from a community, it's like, people are like, oh, well, you're biased. Like you're writing about like, Chinese stuff but it's like, oh, well, nobody else has covered this yet. This is an experience a lot of people have. So it's like, why not write about it? So for me, it's just like going around town, like living my life and seeing what gaps there are and filling those gaps. That's the main way that I come up with stories. And I feel like every journalist, has their own version of what Vancouver is, what Metro Van is, that's going to be different from mine. And I would hope that they draw on whatever experience they have to do a kind of journalism that only they can do.
Yeah, and it's so funny because I remember I was told, I can't remember who said this to me, but it was really something that I've taken with me about the process of journalism. And it was like, always get the name of the dog. Don't just report that there was a dog. And I think when we think about stories, oftentimes we, because the news cycle is so fast and we got to keep up and news is constantly changing, that we often just say there is a dog, like this thing is happening, but then we forget like, okay, what's behind it, and why is it there, and why does it matter, and who goes there, who visits there, who eats there, why? And we forget the why, because the nature of our industry, Chris, is now becoming so fast paced that you got to keep up and you got to race to get, you know, that article out, that we forget asking why. So maybe the stories for myself is maybe, you know, I don't always get things out at the fastest pace anymore, but thanks to the nature of my job, which has slowed it down a little bit, I can work on stories a little longer and ask the why.
I can't even handle daily, so kudos to you.
Everything is moving so fast at all times, but yeah.
Oh, sorry, there's one thing I want to say. Always name the dog. I used to think that was the cutest thing, because it's like, oh wow, this is so literary, like we're gonna have, you know, a bit of personality in like this person's dog. But it's like there's stories where people of color won't even be named,
yeah,
in a piece, and then they're the focus of the piece. And I'm like, are you saying that you're going to name this dog, but you're not going to name this person, or even find a source to talk about whatever it is you're reporting about?
Yeah, lots of missing gaps there, and prioritizing stories by the why. I think there's so many whys. Yeah.
I guess we should pick one more question. I remember you had one, right? Like going beyond beautiful Canada and model minority stories.
Oh, how to go beyond beautiful Canada and model minority stories.
Yeah, I think we should both answer that one. That one's really tough.
Oh yeah, I know it's tough because I've fallen trapped to this, like the idea that we do live in this diverse, beautiful place, blah blah blah. You know, that's the narrative.
And if you challenge it, you hate Canada.
Yeah,
and
if you disagree, then like why you should be ashamed, and your parents came to this country for what reason? To have an ungrateful child. But I think to go beyond beautiful Canada, I think it's also going back to the why, and really asking people what matters to them. I think it's really easy and great to do stories about why, you know, our communities are beautiful, and those stories are important. Again, they're not bad stories, but asking a little bit deeper of our stories and our understanding of things is something that we can all do better, I think, as journalists. Taking that extra time to maybe see like what gaps am I missing here. And Chris, you gave such a great example about your baklava story and the baklava man, and how you went beyond that. There's this really nice man who's selling sweets on the street. Like that could have been a story, but you were able to go beyond that. And I think we all need to strive to do that in our reporting, because there's so many whys that are not answered. There's so many stories of people that we're not even touching on, or why things are happening, because we're not maybe asking the right questions or framing it the right way. We're just looking at, this is a beautiful Canada story, but what's behind that? And I think that should be our goal, is to challenge ourselves in that way.
Yeah. That the story you mentioned, the baklava story, I feel like that really changed me, because I worried about exactly what you mentioned. So for people who aren't familiar with the story, this was a guy he was a Syrian refugee who's selling baklava on the street, and he turned out to be a Syrian parliamentarian, a former one. And so I totally could have seen a story exactly like that just written, be like, oh wow, like he loves his new home and he's doing something sweet, haha, and he loves Canada, and then just end it there. But I see a lot of pieces like that, right? So it's like, oh well, there's a cute Asian lady who's picking up cans and she's donating all of it, but all of the money, or it's like, well, why are people doing these things? Like, why is this guy like on the street selling stuff as a refugee? Like, what are the supports here? Why is the city giving him such a hard time? Like, why do people who are like poor have to do these things? And instead we focus on like, oh wow, he's selling this thing, or like this person's doing this good deed in the community and they have like this heart of gold. But it's like, what's the bigger picture here, right? And I think us talking about intersectionality, well, what's the class angle here? What's the labor angle here? All of that stuff is really, really important.
Yeah, it really is. And maybe sitting with that story for a little longer, or sitting with what we want to write about for a little longer, and being like, have I really asked all the questions here? And there's, as you just mentioned there, with that one story, there was so many questions that you came up with that needed to be answered about why. So, you know, good thing our job is all about the whys. And now we
Yes.
must strive to answer
Oh no,
them
we
all.
have to go do it.
Yeah, like, oh man, now I got to write about it. But no, I think the why. We'll leave it there. The why. That's why.
Well, think about the why, everybody. So it's 2:01. Thank you for all the great questions. I think we're gonna, someone just said why. We're gonna try to save all of them and maybe do something with it. First thing, before I talk about all the Tyee stuff, thank you so much, Simran, for joining us. Do check out the Burnaby Beacon. They launched this year. It's great. It's also in a newsletter format, but you can also find stories online. And I know last week we had said that that was our last issue, the one yesterday. There's actually one more, which is just reader responses. And there's a lot of great stuff in there. So keep an eye out for that. You know, we're still reporting. It's not like I'm giving up now, like after I've done this project. So if you do want to follow along with what we have in the Tyee, especially, you know, we're still pursuing issues to do with race, and all of that. Do check out all of our other newsletters. I think there's a link in the description of the YouTube. And you'll also have noticed that this is all free. Like the Tyee has no paywall, but it's not free for us. I mean, it's thanks to the financial support from our readers that we can make all of the journalism accessible to everybody. So if you do want to chip in and join us as a monthly donor, like I promise you, you will wake up every morning and feel like a better person. You will have an extra spring in your step, like when you walk around. So that's also in the description. I don't know why there's laughter coming out from above, but this is all true. And that's it. Thank you so much for the conversation, Simran. This was a lot of fun. Like we should do this again.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Chris. It's been a real honor because I'm not paid to say this, but I really do admire you and your work and the work that the Tyee does. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Sorry about my Wi-Fi problems and my dog, but he's cute.
You have to show us the dog next time. This is
yeah, see, people probably don't believe I have a dog, but he's down here just gnawing
just
away.
have a Roomba down there.
Yeah, but thank you so much. This was such a great conversation.
Right. Well, we'll be chasing the why later on. So lots more journalism to do.
Yes.
And I hope to hear from everybody in the new year as well.
Yeah. Take care.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Simran. And thank you to our tech people, Em and Jacob.
Yeah, thank you so much. Chris and I, we don't even know what Zoom is. So thank you.
I've never used Zoom. I've never done a Zoom. So thank you.
Thanks.